4. So welcome everybody. I see that there are at least 30 people watching us now and listening to this new DASH webinar. Welcome. Today we're going to have a session on trustworthiness of AI applications in healthcare. We have guests from the Florida Atlantic University that are giving the presentations today, so we're very happy that they are joining us. Christian Garbin and Oge Marques. I will introduce them a little bit later on, but first I want to give a short introduction on DASH. As usual, DASH is the Data Science Center in Health of the University Medical Center Groningen. We are not a department within the UMCG, but we are a small group of people that are working on progressing data science within the organization. To do this, we have different tasks that we are running at this moment, which is projects. We're doing DASH projects with people within the UMCG to help them in their data science quests that they have. We're working on community building, getting people together to learn about data science and AI, and also to collaborate on that. For that, we also have our incubator where we look at the collaboration with companies, for example. We look at funding opportunities from DASH ourselves, but also we can help you to write, for example, the parts in your proposal that are concerning data science and help you to write work packages for that to get funding to also do something in the field of data science within your clinical project. We have the machine learning lab, which I'm heading, where we have a lot of people working on all kinds of different projects as PhDs and postdocs on the application of machine learning in all kinds of different areas. A lot of it is in imaging, in radiology and in radiotherapy, but also other projects are taken on. We look at the needs assessment, so what do the people within the UMCG need from us to be able to further their knowledge and their skills and their abilities in data science. We look at education. We are developing education sessions for different faculties, but also these kind of sessions like this webinar that we organized also as a part of the education effort that we have. And of course communication, telling people about what the UMCG does in the field of data science, telling that to the outside world, and also sharing this kind of events, so the webinars and the short classes that we have. Everything is recorded and available again through our webpage, and you can look at it later on or communicate it to other people to also enjoy the content. So with that, the introduction of DASH. For today's session, as always, please put your microphones on mute. If you have a question, you can raise your hand. There is in your interface, there's a little doll with the hand raised. You can press that button and then we'll see you pop up. Or you can type a question in the chat. When you raise your hand, wait for your turn, then we'll give you the word and then you can put on your mic. The webinar will be recorded and can be viewed later, as I said. And now I would like to introduce to you our speakers of today. First will be Oge Marques. He is an award-winning educator and researcher in the area of visual artificial intelligence. He is professor of engineering and computer science at the Florida Atlantic University and also advisor for the AI in Healthcare Interest Group in the College of Medicine. He's actively working on the intersection between AI and radiology with medical professionals, researchers in the US and abroad. He is currently working on a book, AI for Radiology, which is scheduled to appear later this year. Christian Garbin is a researcher in the field of implications of machine learning products. His masterpiece is focused on how to improve reporting, increase transparency, and reduce failures in machine learning applications in healthcare. Currently, he is a senior architect and a distinguished expert at Atos and PhD candidate at the Florida Atlantic University, focusing on the implications of machine learning products for users and society at large. Oge and Christian will both give a presentation. Oge will start and then Christian will follow. If you have questions, we can do some questions in between if you have specific questions for Oge. If not, then we'll collect all the questions later on, and we'll do the questioning session after Christian has finished his presentation. So with that, I would like to give the screen to Oge for the first presentation.
Thank you very much, Peter, for the kind introduction. Thank you all from DASH and University Medical Center Groningen at large for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here today speaking about AI in the context of healthcare and focusing more specifically on aspects of trustworthiness and responsible AI and machine learning practices. For starters, Christian and I have no conflicts of interest related to the material discussed in this talk. The take-home message for today is basically this. Building trustworthy AI products in healthcare requires detailed and structured descriptions of data sets and models. We believe and postulate and will try to demonstrate that checklists and guidelines are good, necessary foundations for a responsible AI lifecycle. This is roughly the plan for this talk. We will start after a brief introduction to AI, machine learning, and deep learning. We'll talk about how AI can occasionally do awful things, how things can go wrong, and given that in healthcare there's a lot at stake, how we should do everything we can to avoid AI doing awful things. We will postulate that in order to do so, we should build AI in a responsible way, which basically means we'll try to establish the connection between responsible AI practices and the trustworthiness of the resulting solutions that will result as a concrete consequence of adopting such responsible practices. Of course, when we get to this point, trustworthiness in the context of AI applications, particularly in healthcare, there are lots of discussions going on. This is a very hot, timely topic, and many of those discussions are too abstract. For the interest of the audience, people who really build, implement, document, deploy, and maintain AI products, we will briefly review the abstract aspects, but try to go to concrete solutions. In other words, try to answer the question, yes, but how? And that is the point where I will hand over to Christian, and he will talk specifically about how checklists for both data sets and models and associated practices can help build responsible AI pipelines and workflows, which in turn will lead to trustworthy AI products and solutions. So during the course of my part of the presentation, you will see slides like this that have a key idea that I hope will be clear in your minds at the end of this webinar. The first of which is a reminder for most people in the audience that what we call AI today is mostly machine learning, or more specifically, deep learning. You all have seen a diagram like this that shows that machine learning is a subset of AI and deep learning is a subset of machine learning. And more importantly, perhaps than this slide, is this one from François Chollet's textbook that shows that in classical programming or classical AI, rule-based AI, through the 1980s, for instance, the basic way by which we would build AI solutions would be to get data and encode rules that apply to this data would elicit answers. The machine learning paradigm somehow flips this picture upside down by giving a lot of labeled data in the supervised machine learning paradigm to an algorithm and figuring out the patterns, the rules by which new data, when presented to this solution, can be classified or predictions can be made and so on. So clearly, the reliance on data and the need for high quality, large amounts of data plays a significant role in this whole picture. Just to give an example from the field of dermatology, in the old days, if I were in charge of creating a skin lesion classification solution, I would probably interview dermatologists who would tell me how they go about figuring out if a lesion is normal or cancerous based on the ABCDE mnemonic. I would try to learn those rules, encode them in my system somehow, and then test with new data and refine and improve. And this being non-tabular data, pixel data, of course, much of the challenge would be in the feature extraction part, where I would have to figure out how to elicit concepts such as asymmetry or color variegation or size based on pixel information. In the deep learning paradigm, what we do is basically give a vast amount of labeled examples to a deep learning model, typically a variation of a convolutional neural network in this case, refine and iterate and let the system figure out the rules by adjusting weights and biases by itself until we deem it to be good enough to be deployed and we test it on new data. Clearly, the amount of data, the quality of the data play a significant role in the overall performance, and so do the parameters and hyperparameters upon which the model was tested. The next key idea, and I'll be very brief, is that things can go wrong, and they often do. So sometimes AI makes serious blunders. They make the headlines, and you have seen this for fields as diverse as criminal justice, or the Microsoft chatbot, or self-driving vehicles getting involved in accidents, and so on. If you are really interested in this topic, these are two good places to go. One is called Awful AI on GitHub. The other one is called incidentdatabase.ai, and you have plenty to look at, including incidents classified by category and so on. Let's focus on some reasons why things can go wrong. One being that the data upon which contemporary machine learning, deep learning models learn can be messy. You want to work with large amounts of high quality data, but what you get is not always equally good and clean and helpful and useful and fair and evenly distributed and so on. The second reason why things can go wrong is that the models are often opaque. This is the so-called black box associated with deep learning models, and this leads to a number of ongoing efforts in AI to either build interpretable models or to explain the model's decisions after the fact, the so-called field of explainable AI or XAI. And also, one reason why things can go wrong is that the process itself is poorly documented. We'll see that this combination of data, models, and documentation will be fundamentally important as Christian describes our ongoing and past work in this space. The next key idea, models are not perfect. There's one of the many amusing cartoons on Twitter goes more or less like this. On the left, you have the data that you think you have, and on the right, the data that you actually have, as a caution to data scientists, machine learning folks, and so on, that before you go much further, spend time with your data, look at it carefully, make all the proper exploratory data analysis before moving further. When it comes to the interface between data and models, things can go wrong for a number of other different reasons. In her book, Weapons of Math Destruction, excellent book, by the way, Cathy O'Neil describes 3 elements of problematic decisions made by AI and machine learning. One is the aspect of opacity, the other one is scale, and the other one is the amount of damage. So decisions are not often explained properly. The scale at which they are deployed impacts potentially millions or hundreds of millions of people, say users on Twitter, and the damage they can do can be large and oftentimes irreversible. I like Cathy O'Neil's quote that says that models are opinions embedded in mathematics, and that's a good one to keep in mind. As much as we like to think of the mathematical consistency and rigorous aspects of a model, they often implicitly code opinions and biases by their creators or users. The next key idea is that AI should not be awful in high-stakes areas such as healthcare. That's an easy one to accept. And if you think about the AI healthcare scope, both in terms of the time axis from embryo selection for IVF, in other words, before we are even born, to predicting death in palliative care, in hospital stays. There are an infinitely large number of areas in medicine in which AI can be applied. Or looking at it from the perspective of the variety of data, using this picture of a so-called virtual coach model, there are many sources of data from which information can be extracted, used to train, presumably these days, a deep learning model and provide virtual health guidance that is personalized to an individual's health needs. So after looking at awful AI, let's do the transition to responsible AI. So the key idea here being that we should build responsible AI solutions. And because part of my duties are also to teach this type of material, I try to teach how to do so to my students. So I tell them to take a flight between the island of awful AI and fly to the island of responsible AI. Once we arrive at this island of responsible AI or responsible machine learning, we find that this is a highly dynamic, multifaceted, multidisciplinary field. There's a free ebook at the O'Reilly site, which is depicted here, Responsible Machine Learning, that does a very good job summarizing the state of the art. It came out earlier this year, if I'm not mistaken, and it talks about how the building of responsible machine learning workflows depends on people, processes, and technology. In fact, this same book draws a diagram like this that shows that responsible AI has implications and influences from completely different areas, such as human-centered machine learning, explainable AI, security aspects, ethical aspects, and so on. If you look at the literature, you will see, for instance, at the Ethical Institute, 8 guiding principles to provide a practical framework for responsible AI. And we'll see some overlap between the phrases here and the ones in the circles from the previous diagram. Or if you go to Google's responsible AI practices and you look at their list, you will see some commonalities: human-centered design approach, the need to do extensive testing, monitoring after deployment, and so on. All of which are fine, but they look like checklists in a non-structured way, basically laundry lists, if you will. So I would rather have something like this as a blueprint of how these things interact with one another, and perhaps more importantly, where do these recommendations fall within the workflow of machine learning / AI. So this is a classical AI workflow. You can see going from the top left, data, exploratory data analysis, building your first models, assessing, quantifying risks, documenting, eventually deploying. But you'll see things that are more specific to this diagram, including the provision for a kill switch or the ability to have provisions for human appeal of decisions made by the model. In other words, many of the things that we saw in the previous lists become more contextualized once they are put in this AI machine learning workflow that most people in the audience are familiar with, which is good, because instead of just saying we need to explain the decisions of our models, we can see that explanations belong in a certain point. We can see that things that are often taken for granted, such as debugging the model, are explicitly indicated, and so on. So now this is a very important part of today's talk, because I basically want to posit that it is through responsible AI practices that we will build products that will eventually be deemed trustworthy. So let's talk about the other side of the coin, if you will, the trustworthiness side. So the key idea here is that we must build trustworthy AI solutions, especially in the field of healthcare, because we are ultimately facing potential customers, users of our apps, whether they are the final patient or professionals in the medical space. We are facing with customers who need to answer the question, would you trust AI to look after your health? Which brings us to the factors by which one could decide whether they trust AI or not. This is inspired by a talk by Professor Nigam Shah at Stanford. He gave this talk at NIH in July of 2019, and it summarizes the multiple aspects of trustworthiness in AI, Trustworthiness must refer to the data. You build the model. We should be able to trust that the data was proper, the distribution was consistent with the problem, that issues of bias and fairness have been taken care of, that the model itself is trustworthy, it was properly built, debugged, validated, that the workflow around it was well documented, and that the people who built the AI were trustworthy to begin with. Probably the answer to this would be all of the above. So clearly, trustworthy AI is a complex theme, and sometimes in order to answer the big question of how can we make AI in healthcare trustworthy, we end up with more specific questions, some of which are more abstract than others. So let's look at this list of 5 specific questions. One is, what is trustworthiness? Some of you in the audience may be surprised when I say this, but after having attended a recent virtual 2-day webinar on this topic or event, it was clear to me that even the top experts in the world, as of today, don't have a working definition for trustworthiness in the context of AI. That remains to be done. And perhaps more critically, they cannot yet agree on how trustworthiness can be measured or quantified. In fact, even the question of whether this is possible remains open, and the question of how to do so, if it's possible, of course, even more so. These are legitimate questions, all right. There will also be the question of who should be responsible for what. There is an inevitable responsibility assignment process going on here. If something goes wrong, you need to know whose blame it was, not so much for the point of view of blame assignment, but from the point of view of responsibility in every sense of the word. The fourth question interests me a lot, which is basically what happens to the progress of AI if we don't address this issue. So will it get to the point where, in spite of potentially promising developments in the lab, the deployed products turn out not to be trustworthy because we didn't pay attention to things such as the ones that we are discussing today? Will it lead by itself or combined with other factors to another AI winter? Who knows? And finally, to make it more into a call for action, I'm interested in the fifth question. What can we, AI, machine learning developers, and consumers alike, do about it? So the next key idea, which I somehow anticipated earlier because it's crucial to this talk, is that we believe that trustworthy AI, one side of the coin, successful products being trusted by their customers, begins with a responsible AI machine learning workflow, the other side of the equation. And this is not only our thinking or our belief, much the opposite, in fact. This is a diagram from the American FDA proposed total product lifecycle approach and how it is overlaid on a classical AI machine learning workflow. And it is clear, although I won't have time to explain the diagram in great detail, that the orange aspects of the proposed TPLC approach are quite clearly related to what happens in the classical AI model development, the part that most of us spend a lot of time on, the white blocks, the gray blocks, the production model, and the green parts where after putting a model in production, you need to continue to monitor its performance, occasionally retrain the model based on new data, and so on. So clearly, the trustworthiness, the real-world performance monitoring, the things that will get your product FDA cleared will depend on responsible machine learning practices. And going back to the diagram from the Responsible Machine Learning book, we are now about to transition to the part where, having recognized that this is such a large, multidisciplinary, ambitious task to achieve, this whole business of responsible AI, trustworthy AI, we will focus on aspects that we could tackle so far. And as indicated by these red rectangles, they are related to human review and documentation. In other words, we're about to ask the question, yes, we are partially convinced, some of you may say, that what you said makes sense, that responsible AI practices will lead to trustworthiness of the resulting product, but can you show us a little bit of how this can be done? And as the unfortunate popular saying goes, those who know how to do it, do it. Those who don't, teach. And since I'm a teacher and Christian Garbin has been a doer for most of his life, I will now hand over to Christian to take it from here. Take it away, Christian.
Yeah, thanks, Oge. Hello, everyone. So I'm taking over from here for the doing part. And we're going to start with, okay, so knowing the problem and knowing how big the problem is, what can we effectively do today? So at its core, when we're talking about machine learning is just software. So that statement is true, but at the same time is somewhat oversimplified because there are some fundamental differences between traditional software and machine learning software. On a traditional software, we write code that's human readable, like people can read the code, they can inspect, they can infer from that code. On machine learning software, on the other hand, we start with a data set, usually a very large, high-dimensional data set. And we use that to train a generic piece of code, the model. So these are some fundamental differences. And if we look at the machine learning workflow, so this is a somewhat simplified workflow just to go through the most important pieces. From left to right, we start by defining the problem, then we get the data set, the model, go all the way to deploying, and then finally monitoring the product in the field. There are the two stages that are fundamentally different. They are shown here. One is we have to get a large data set, especially true for supervised machine learning training. And then we train that generic piece of code, the model. These two pieces that are fundamentally different, they also happen very early in the machine learning lifecycle. And they're critical for all the other steps that come after it. And they're so critical that they may be potentially fatal for the product. For example, there is no amount of testing that can compensate for flaws in the data set. Some of these failures, to make the problem even bigger, some of these failures, they are obscure. For example, if we have wrong labels in the data set, if the data set does not represent our target population and so on, these are not trivial things to find, and they can hardly be found with tests alone. And some of those failures, they are also complex and they're interrelated. For example, if we care about bias in our machine learning, which we should, of course, there are several places where bias may be introduced when we are creating a machine learning product. We can see some of the examples in this picture. Some of them are related. For example, representation bias affects evaluation bias, and we may not be able to solve one if we don't solve the other. And to make it even more complex, most of the sources for bias, the ones that are highlighted in green, they're visible only during the internal inspection of the model. So to address those failures, we need to audit the creation of the data set. We need to audit the creation of the model. Audits, on the other hand, to be effective, they require transparency. In checklists, they are an effective way to increase transparency. Two checklists have been proposed in the community to increase transparency. One of them is datasheets for datasets, and the other one is model cards. The datasheets for datasets, they document the dataset creation process, including things like which pre-processing tools, recommended uses, and so on. In the model card, as it implies, it also documents the creation process of the model, and also, more importantly, limitations and applications of that model. So let's start. Let's start with the datasheets for datasets. On the right, we can see how it looks like. It's showing the motivation in the composition sections. It also documents in details things like the collection process, the pre-processing done to the raw data, including which tools were used, what uses are recommended and not recommended for the data set, how it's distributed, how it's maintained, and so on. And this is how a model card look like. The model cards, they bring transparency to the next step. So now that we have the data set and we're training the model, how do we bring transparency to that step of the life cycle? So we can see how it looks like on that picture. And it documents the details of the model, like the intended use, in very important both in scope and out of scope use. What factors affect the model performance? For example, race, ratio or age distribution, what equipment was used to collect data for the model, and so on. Let's to demonstrate the dataset transparency, we're going to use a well-known paper in medical imaging, chest X-ray 8. If you worked with models for medical imaging, you probably came across this dataset. At the time it was released, it was probably the largest chest X-ray dataset out there with over 100,000 images. And it was compiled by the NIH Institute, National Institutes of Health in the United States. It's been used in many, many papers. There are several papers about radiology that use this dataset as the dataset to train their model. So this is how we transform, how we create a datasheet for a dataset. On the left side, you can see the paper, the actual paper from chest X-ray in the prose format, like textual format. On the right side, you can see the datasheet for it. It's a structured format. And let's zoom into one particular section of the datasheet to understand what it does in more details. This particular section that we're looking at is about the composition of the dataset. The text that you see in blue, this is the prompt from the datasheet. So the datasheet has these prompts to make us think about the answer. So this is not a yes or no type of checklist. It's to guide us through the thought process of documenting it. So in this particular section, what we're doing is documenting the composition of the dataset. It clearly documents some of the limitations, such as the downsampling of the images. So it's telling us we're not working with the actual DICON, which is the actual digital images. We're working with downsampled images. Also documents the fact that we have reduced grayscale. And also, it documents the fact that the images are coming from only one institution, so this may affect the model with the so-called single source bias. So all this guides us to the process of using this data set more responsibly. And if you look at the datasheet this way, it may look like it has an overall negative tone to it, but that's not the purpose. Like every data set, and I mean every data set out there, has limitations. They do. What we need is we need to clearly understand them up front so that we can use the data set where it's appropriate and avoid pitfalls in the cases where it's not appropriate. So switching now to the model cards, and we're going to do the same here to demonstrate model cards. We're going to use a famous paper in radiology, the CheXNet. When it came out, it claimed to provide radiologist level pneumonia detection. It was a pretty good model, nothing against the claim. It was created by a Stanford team based on the chest X-ray dataset. You know, the dataset we just saw. So it was created with that dataset. But it had one fundamental difference. The test set that they used was curated by radiologists. So the radiologists labeled the test set. So that was an important and fundamental difference. To create the model card, we went through the same process. On the left side, you can see the traditional format of a paper, like the sections with the textual description. On the right side, what we see is the structured format of a model card. Let's do the same as we did for the datasheet, and let's look at one particular section. The model cards have this section called caveats and recommendations, so that's the section that we're looking at. And in this case, it's going to guide us through some important factors for that claim that we saw before, the radiologist level pneumonia detection claim. So here we can better establish that claim. For example, we can see that the radiologists worked with the downscaled images from the dataset, not the original X-ray images. They worked without the patient records, so they work only with the images, and a few other things like that. So while the accomplishment of the paper, they're still groundbreaking, there's even to this date, it's a great accomplishment. Understanding how it was measured provide us a more balanced view on what the model is able to achieve. As in the case of the dataset example that we saw, it may have this negative connotation, but just like for the dataset, every model has a specific application and has limitations. Again, I mean every model has specific applications, specific limitations. And it's very important for us to understand those applications and limitations to use the model effectively. And that's what a model card like this one does. So now creating the datasheet and creating the model card is definitely a step forward, but they become even more useful when they're made public so that we can engage with the community, make them easy to modify and to improve upon. The datasheet that we saw here and the model card that we saw here, we made them available in GitHub with the 2 links that you see here, with the intention of making the entire process and the content transparent to the community. So with that, we just saw how we can increase transparency in the early stages of the machine learning lifecycle. And that's good, so that's one step forward, but in the end, we want to bring transparency all the way to the end user, to the point where our products are being used. And just a recent proposal to increase transparency for the end user is something called model facts. And as you can see from the picture, it resembles the labels or the leaflets that we see in medicine packages. And this is done on purpose because the goal is similar. The goal is to clearly explain the uses, directions, and importantly, the limitations of our product. So it's what the authors call actionable information for the end user. So this is beyond the technical description of our processes, but how do we actually apply that product in real life? And now that we added yet another checklist, we begin to see them as a series of checklists that are built throughout the machine learning lifecycle. In each one of those checklists, they build on the previous one. And if we link them together, we can avoid some duplication of work, and we can increase their accuracy or in the process and the efficiency to create those throughout the processes. If we step back even further, we see a similar picture in a larger context. We have discussed so far the checklists that are directly related to the machine learning lifecycle. However, the machine learning work that we do is part of an even larger picture. For example, in the realm of healthcare applications, we have some general healthcare checklists. You probably came across Consort and Tripod. These general checklists, they're being customized for AI. For example, the recently released AI extension for Consort, the Consort AI. And also recently, some of the healthcare journals, they're publishing their own set of checklists, like Claim, or for the radiology journal, they publish their AI guide. As we add more checklists for specific purposes, then we should approach them as a pipeline of checklists so that we can build them more efficiently and more accurately. For example, in this picture here, we can see a pipeline of sorts for checklists in medical image machine learning. Starting from the top, we see those 2 fundamental checklists that describe the dataset, that describe the model. As we go further down, then we have more specific checklists, like general healthcare checklists, Consort, Tripod, all the way to specific checklists in a certain publication. So with that in mind, the key message that we would like to leave behind with this piece is that developing machine learning products is not only a technical endeavor. Of course, there's many technical aspects to it, how to pre-process data, how to train the model, and so on. But there's still much need for human judgment, and we need mechanisms to keep humans in the loop through the entire process. And we believe that using checklists like the ones that we just explored, we believe that using them, these are effective tools to keep, these are tools to keep humans involved in the process in an efficient and effective way. And with that, we are reaching the end of our talk. And we would like now just to review quickly what we've done. So we started with the many things that can go wrong in machine learning. Then we moved on through responsible AI and trustworthy AI. And once we reach that point, then we move to more concrete steps of what we can do today to move into that direction. So with that in mind, then we would like to open the floor for Q&A.
Thank you very much. A very interesting topic, very interesting presentations for both of you. Are there any questions from the audience? I I don't see anything in the chat yet. Maybe I can start off. Oh, there is a question by Bart for Christian. Do you have experience with FDA adoption of applications using AI?
That might be a question actually better suited for Oge, but I'll try to answer at least my part. I have some experience because as I was doing this work from a more technical perspective of how do we create the products. I investigated how the FDA is moving into that direction, and currently they have an open, they have a technical term for that. I think it's a request for comments, but they have a paper where they're asking for comments. And they're going through the same processes of trying to make sure that we're creating reliable and secure products. And one of the main factors that they ask for is reproducibility, the reproducibility or datability of your processes. And this is where those checklists come into place, is to make sure that at least those two fundamental steps of the dataset creation and of the model creation are properly documented, which is a fundamental step for some of the FDA processes. In Oge, you might have even more experience with FDA being closer to the NIH.
Right. Even though I don't have any experience trying to get AI solutions cleared by the FDA, I've been following the entire ecosystem, and I have two observations to make. One that is somehow explicit in slide 57. For those who are interested, the American College of Radiology, through its Data Science Institute, has published or made available a portal on the web with a list of FDA cleared models. Last time I checked, there were 110 products. There might be more if you go there today. And you can search and filter by a number of aspects. And very importantly, you can look at documents that reflect how the models were described from the developers to the FDA. In fact, you can see even official documentation of the exchanges between offices and a few other checklist-like documents associated with each model as well. So that's one point. I encourage people to go to that website if you're interested. The other point I wanted to make is that in recent discussions in a webinar promoted by the American College of Radiology, in which they officially introduced this portal, that was about a month or 5-6 weeks ago, they made an interesting point that radiologists amongst yourselves will probably agree with, that FDA clearance from the point of view of the radiologist is just a bar to be cleared. That radiologists will look at an FDA cleared product and still want to know the effectiveness of that product in clinical practice. In other words, that clearance with the FDA is a good prerequisite, but it's not the end of the story. Radiologists are busy developing metrics for effectiveness of FDA cleared applications in clinical practice, and we'll probably see a paper along those lines coming up from ACR related experts very soon.
Okay, Bart, I hope that answers your question. There's also a question from Koen, because there are a lot of references to resources. By the way, he says great presentation. And he asked if it's possible to distribute the slides or the references somehow.
That's perfectly fine with us.
Okay, then that's the answer to that question. Are there any other questions? I still have some myself also. In the process where you look at those model cards, what you showed now is there was a paper, and you got the information from the paper and built that model card. But I assume that it's the idea that you also start doing this when you start developing your own AI, and you also use those model cards to describe your data set and describe your model, etc. Are you then also going to use it as an iterative step in your development process? So are you going to use what you assess in your card to go a step back and to maybe change things or correct things?
That's a very good question, because it goes to a fundamental process question here. The way we've done here is we created this after the fact. We took the existing papers and then we created the datasheet in the model card as an example to illustrate how structuring the information makes that information easier to access. However, the proper way to do that, in my opinion, is that you do throughout the process for a number of reasons. Number one is that you have the people who are creating it involved through it. And some of the questions, I recommend you going especially through the Datasheets for datasets paper. Some of the questions may change the way you are approaching the problem as you are solving it. They're great questions that may guide you through the process. And also you have information firsthand from people who are doing it at the point where it's being collected, so people feel more responsible for the information. And also it avoids one problem that we saw. We are currently working on another model, actually datasheet, with the Stanford team, and we noticed that as we are creating this after the fact, some information was lost. We had to go back to certain people and ask questions that they no longer remember the details, they no longer remember exactly how they have done things and so on. So creating after the fact is definitely not recommended. Number one, because the process of creation may affect how you create it. Number two is because you get the responsible people directly involved. Number three is because you don't lose information. So definitely, if you have the choice, do it as you're creating the data set, do it as you're creating the model.
Yeah, so that then you can really use it as a set of documents that goes with your project, and in the end of your project you have it fully documented, you have all the information there, and basically then you start writing the paper from your model cards and not vice versa.
And I can almost guarantee you that's going to change how you're doing it, just because you have to think through things that maybe you don't think through ahead of time.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting way to approach it. So I would ask people, there are some people in the audience that are also developing, so I would also like to hear their ideas about this. So if you can put something in the chat or speak up. One other thing that I was also thinking about, because you're trying to you showed the different steps in that development, and a part of it is getting that trustworthiness of your AI. Now, if we look at the trustworthiness of a product, and I think the current situation with the COVID vaccinations is a very good example, the communication to the user is going to be a very important part in how you communicate it to that user. Because now side effects of a vaccination are communicated to the general public, and they are refusing their vaccination, while the chance of a serious side effect is very, very, very small. But because of the communication, because of the situation it's in, it changes the way the trustworthiness is perceived by the general public. So how are you going to deal with that with AI? How are we going to deal with the trustworthiness that is affected by the perception of the patient that is confronted with the use of AI by their doctor or other healthcare provider?
Let me try to take that. I second your comments, Peter, 100% regarding, for instance, the current situation of COVID-19, vaccination, and so on. As you know, I'm very interested in science communication in general. I believe that science should be communicated to the entire population at multiple levels of technical sophistication. And I think that when it comes to the pandemic, we may be experiencing a kind of a systemic failure. Even knowledgeable people, people with scientific background, may not know enough to take action, to make decisions. And we start to realize that what Christian showed in this slide becomes extremely important. It's not only about the trust that people who are inside the lab can acquire by looking at the proper, say, responsible machine learning documentation, but it's what gets communicated outside of that context. As we know from literature in trust in general, trust is a transitive process. Much of what we do in life is because we trust someone who told us that this is safe without actually checking to see if it's safe, but it comes from a reliable source. And the other thing, of course, is trust is context dependent. I love the simple example that says, I trust my brother to take me to the airport, but if he also volunteers to fly the plane, I'll say, wait, stop right there. I trust you for this, but I don't trust you for that. So we are still navigating this space. I think it's anyone's guess as to how this is going to play out. Of course, there's a role that authoritative bodies such as the FDA and their counterpart in the European Union will have to play. So there is a transitive trust when you get something that is FDA cleared or FDA approved, of course, but the process seems to be more complex than that. And it's built on the volatile ground that AI sits on in general. So it's a compound challenge, in my opinion. And it's even made more difficult by the scientific communication barrier at the end. So interesting challenges in multiple dimensions there, which we'll have to wait and see and maybe try to help to minimize the negative impact as much as we can.
Okay, thank you. I agree. It's going to be it's challenging. It's challenging to see how we communicate this with the general public and how they will perceive it. And the thing with AI is that it will be influenced even by self-driving cars, etc. When they crash, then all of a sudden the trustworthiness of all of AI goes down because they say it's an AI that failed. So then people lose their trustworthiness in it. So it's going to be very interesting to see how we can communicate, and maybe also how we can take those model cards, etc., and put them in layman terms and see if we can somehow transform it to the general public also.
And that's why we illustrate with model facts, which is closer to the end user than model cards themselves. But just a quick bit on the self-driving vehicles, another related problem, as we all know, is that any incident gets blown out of proportion, right? One accident involving a self-driving vehicle gets more publicity than thousands of accidents, including real drivers and real cars. So that's another obstacle. Yes.
Yeah. There is a question in the chat from Koen. Explainable AI was touched upon shortly. How do you see its interaction with the checklists and model cards?
I'd like to take the first part of that one, and then maybe, Oge, you want to complement it. But in the context of deep learning, where we have these large and complex models, and they're usually black boxes, one problem that shows up with explainable AI is that we may be explaining the wrong thing. So we don't understand how the model works. And if we just explain the model, how do we know that we're explaining the right thing? So the interaction that I see with the checklists is that if we're going to explain something that we don't quite understand, can we understand it better before we try to explain? So what was the process to create it? What was the data used to create it? Is the data appropriate? How was the model created? Was it created in a good way? Is the explanation that we're trying to do, was it under the scope of the user of that model, under the known limitations of that model or not? So they give context to the later phase of the explanation. So that's where I see the interaction in this particular case of deep learning.
If you allow me to just supplement Christian's answer, I agree with everything he said, and I just want to supplement 2 bits here. One, going back to this slide that shows the work described in this talk in relationship to the overall machine learning workflow, we can see that what we are recommending here works regardless of whether you go through the path of post hoc explainable AI techniques or not. That's one thing. The other thing is the relationship between explainability and trustworthiness is a little bit young in the literature. So a month ago or so, my colleague Felipe Kitamura and I the Journal of the ACR, in which we claim that explainability is not necessary for trustworthiness. in fact, it's not sufficient, and in fact, it might not be necessary. We welcome you to take a look at that paper if you're interested. And I'll try to put the link on the chat after I finish answering this question. And the other part I want to mention very briefly is that some of the comments Christian made about post hoc explainability not being enough is inspired by the work of Cynthia Rudin at Duke University, where her team is busy building deep learning models with interpretability properties built in, an architecture that goes by the name of Proto-PNet, for instance. In other words, she shows the limitations of explaining black box models. There's a paper on Nature Machine Learning, if I'm not mistaken, whose title is Stop Explaining Black Box Models. And she claims that building models with interpretable features is recommended instead. So there's a lot to be done in that space. And the work that is done in that space is somehow orthogonal to model cards, data sheets, and so on, because regardless of whether you touch upon these blocks, you will need good review, good documentation, and all the practices that we recommended earlier.
Yes, thank you. I fully agree. And I think you also, you touched upon the example of the X-ray, thoracic X-ray data sets where you had treated patients and they were misclassified, etc. So I think a lot of it is also in the origin of your data and having the data set in a correct way. There was also an interesting letter to the editor in European Radiology recently. I think it was in the end of 2020 when two people sent a letter to the editor saying it's nice that there are such AI enthusiasts that are running around and doing all kinds of things in COVID-19 solutions, but they are working with toy data sets and they're doing radiology without the radiologists. So they are not knowledgeable about the data that they are using and what they are actually looking at. So I think it's very important to have that knowledge also in and have the joint effort of getting these tools developed and also validated in clinical practice. We're running towards 5 o'clock, so I think I can, Koen says, thanks for the answers. I think there is a interesting question by Jennifer, and then we'll take that one as the last question. She says, are some AIs rewritten after model card is updated? Or maybe an AI was made before the use of model cards and then rewritten? Or do AI need to be written after a particular update?
If you mean by that rewriting the model or rewriting the solution itself, the answer is most definitely yes, because as you create a model card, some of those questions may question how you created the model itself. It may cause you to go back and redo at least certain pieces of the model, or at least measure again certain pieces of the model. So it's very likely, especially if you just, quote, just created a model without paying attention to some more fine items, then you will very likely have to go back. That's why going back to Peter's question, is better if you create your model, create your solution, and create the model cards together, because then you avoid this rework and so on. But one concrete case is some models are retrained. Someone asked a question about the FDA approval. FDA is very concerned about something called software as medical devices that can be retrained on the fly. So in those cases, the model cards have to be updated because they will carry data about the accuracy of the model, especially accuracy within specific groups, like age groups and so on. So that's definitely that is going around all the time. It's not a static, it's not a one deal thing that you do once and then that's it.
Okay, thank you. I think we're gonna try and wrap up because we're past 5 o'clock. One thing that I would like to mention, Oge showed his slide with the book by Cathy O'Neill on weapons of math destruction. One of my colleagues in Dash told us about a very interesting documentary on Netflix. So if you have Netflix, it's called Coded Bias. And it's a very nice documentary talking about these kind of problems with the data that is used for certain applications, they mainly focus on surveillance camera images, etc. But it's very interesting to look at and to give you kind of perspective on AI and the use of that. And Cathy O'Neill is also starring in part of that documentary as one of the people that they interview. So also her book comes along there. So it's a very nice documentary to look at. With that, we're going to close up. I would like to thank Oge and Christian for presenting here. It's been a very nice presentation by both of you, and I think we had a very good discussion. A lot of fruit to talk about and to think about. So I think we will get back to you on this and have some further discussions on how to also start looking at using these kind of methodologies that you propose within our developments, but also in the process of getting AI accepted into the clinical field. Also, Femke, thanks for setting it up again and being the organizer on the background and taking care that I get the right slides in front of me. So these are our ways to get in touch with Dash. So if you have any questions, you can go to our LinkedIn page. You can mail at dash@umcg.nl or go to the new UMCG research website, where we also have our separate page. We will post this whole lecture, so if you have other people that would like to look at it, it's possible. And I will see with Oge if we can make some kind of list with the references that are inside the slides, so you have an easy way of clicking on them and going forward, and we'll put it on the website somewhere.
All right.
So with that, thanks again for being here, and hope to see you in our next Dash event. So keep an eye on our LinkedIn to know what's up next and what the dates and times are. Thank you.
Again,
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all. Thank you.